Okay, now back to just a sports fan, and this is going to be the weekend wrap up video. I was sick this past week, so I really couldn't do anything. But with the All Star break basically ending, I thought, why not to look back at the season, look at teams and trends and comparisons and how they might be doing. So the first video is going to be focusing on the Golden State Warriors, their run this season, and which team I think that they compare to. Not exactly the same way, but in their makeup. And the first things first for the Warriors. Not only are they a great offensive team, but also they're a very good defensive team. And in the playoffs, you're likely going to face teams with good offenses. And if you look at offensive efficiency per 100% per 100 possessions, according to NBA.com, of the 9 other teams in the top 10 offensively, along with the Warriors, eight of them are guaranteed a spot. A ninth could go either way, and that's the Houston Rockets, and the 10th team is the New Orleans Pelicans, which shouldn't come as a surprise because they have Anthony Davis and they brought in Gentry from the Warriors, and this is a guy that used to run Phoenix, and so it's not a surprise that they're doing better offensively, despite the fact of all the injuries that they've had to deal with and the disappointment that they're dealing with. But one of the things that I've noticed is about the Warriors. So if you're great defensively and you're gonna face great offensive teams, in the playoffs, how do you attack them? The first way, I needed this. The first way, I think, to look at this is, do you try to slow them down? Because everyone says in the playoffs it slows down, or do you try to speed it up? And the Boston Celtics are an interesting team because they're a very good defensive team, but they also like to go up tempo and can score offensively. And they played that double or triple overtime game like back in November, December against the Warriors, and it was exciting, but it was a kind of a grinded out type of game. And if you look at per 100 possessions, both teams were worse offensively. The Warriors much worse offensively, but defensively, they were also better. And it was a situation where, if you watch those overtime periods, they didn't really. And I'm kind of surprised by Brad Stevens and what he did, because I think that from the times that I've seen him, he seems to be a pretty good designer of plays out of timeouts. But it was just a situation where it was like isolation and then really bad shot, and they ended up losing that game to the Warriors. But other teams have decided to push the pace. One of the teams that decided to push the pace so far against them is Portland, and you saw the blowout win right after the All-Star break. And the blowout win. But other teams have tried to run with them offensively, and it hasn't worked out. Two of those teams are the Clippers and the Raptors, who played them 5 times combined, and they're 0-5. And the games have been relatively close, but while both teams have been able to score against Golden State at a much more efficient pace than the Warriors normally allow, the Warriors have also scored against them at a much more efficient pace than they normally do. So it's like, by going faster, you're almost playing into their hands, but going slower, they really can't slow them down as much as you would hope to. Even if it's in the playoffs, I don't think you really can. So if you're going to try to beat them offensively, you need to basically play out of your mind for four games. And unless you're the Greg Popovich and the Spurs, you're going to need to play out of your mind offensively and hope that they miss some shots down the stretch defensively. And that doesn't seem like a good strategy, because you're having hope as a strategy, and you can't play well against them defensively if you're going to push the tempo, because they have so many weapons. Now, which is remarkable, because the team that I compared them to is the early 2000, mid-2000 Detroit Pistons, and the reason why I do that is because the Golden State Warriors have a superstar in Steph Curry, and then either they have a second star maybe in either Draymond Green or Klay Thompson. I don't think that one of them is definitely a role player quality, and is benefiting from the system. I tend to say that Draymond Green, because he was a second round pick and a guy who that the Warriors gave an opportunity to play despite his All-Star season and triple doubles. He seems to be a guy that's benefited from playing in the system and the players around him. But if you remember the Detroit Pistons team, they had basically Chauncey Billups, who wasn't a superstar, but it was a star, and then they had a bunch of role players around him. You know, Richard Hamilton, Tayshaun Prince, Rasheed Wallace, who used to be a star, but by then was a role player, and then Ben Wallace, who was rated as a defensive superstar, defensive force, and wasn't a star himself. Then they had, I believe, I think their top bench guys were like Okor, Carlos Williamson, things like that. And they were basically a defensive first team that had a bunch of role players come together. And the circumstances also between the Warriors and the Pistons also run the same in a way. Both of them, the Pistons, were resurrected by Rick Carlisle. They had Grant Hill. They lost him to the Magic after the playoffs, and he injured his ankle. He was never really the same player. They had a losing season. Rick Carlisle comes in, back-to-back 50-win seasons, gets fired, gets replaced by Larry Brown. And they win the championship in their first year. Last two seasons, was it 98 wins for Mark Jackson, including a 50-win season. Team ownership was like, we don't want him, we think we could do better. In comes in Steve Kerr. They win the championship. You look at Steph Curry and you look at Chauncey Billups. Chauncey Billups bounced around, really didn't have a home. Steph Curry had all those ankle problems, and even the Warriors weren't sure. They kind of signed him to a show-me contract, which is one of the reasons why they will have the funds possible to go after Kevin Durant. I don't think he's going to come to Golden State, but if I'm wrong and he does, one of the reasons will be the contract that is signed by Steph Curry. And after that, you know, you look at his backcourt running mate is very different from between the 2 point guards, with Klay Thompson being such a prolific perimeter shooter and Rep Hamilton wasn't. He was more like a guy that ran around, ran through screens, and scored that way, and was more of a crafty scorer. But they also fit in a way that they complement one another. In the ways that the way that Thompson complements Steph is the same way that Hamilton complemented Billups. And then you have, I think, Draymond Green, who plays a little bit of the role of both Ben Wallace and Rasheed Wallace. He's the guy that people don't know how to quite match up against. He's the defensive anchor at center. Plus, he's versatile and is able to score and pass and assist in many, pass and assist are the same words. And if you remember Rasheed Wallace, he was a stretch four. He was a stretch four before there really was too many stretch fours in the NBA. And he was kind of a defensive mismatch. And then also was the outward, vocal, emotional force. And Green plays that same role with the Warriors. And then there's Tayshaun Prince and Harrison Barnes. You've got 6'8", 6'9", wing guys who can defend and sometimes has to knock down shots. Now Barnes is a better shooter than Prince, but the big difference is there is no Andre Iguodala on the Pistons, excuse me. They had Carlos Williamson and Mehmet Okur, who were their main guys coming off the bench, versus Livingston, Iguodala, and Barbosa. If you want to say Spades, but I think that's pushing it, and maybe Andrew Bogut when he's not starting. I think both of those guys would not fit into that same category as a Williamson or an Okur, and that's pretty much it. I mean, I never said that they were the exact same fit, but do you agree that in ways that the Warriors and the Pistons teams are similar? And how would you try to beat the Warriors? Would you try to um, try to outgun them basically? And is that possible in the playoffs, or do you go with conventional wisdom and say, let's grind it up, knock it up, and maybe take some few cheap shots at Curry? And before I close, one thing that I've noticed is the way that you can actually try to interfere with their offense a little bit. I know that they're probably going to have Iguodala or Livingston come into the game to handle the ball if you start pressing Curry and denying him the ability to inbound, so he doesn't take one of those basically dribble, launch three-pointers, and they'll just have another person handle the ball. But I would rather take my chances with those two guys bringing the ball up the court and trying to guard Curry and denying him the ball and taking him away. That's basically that walk up, that sprint up 3-point shot. Also, one thing that I've noticed is another play that they tend to run, or a similar play, is Curry will dribble up the court and he'll get pressured and he'll give the ball up and he'll kind of like loop around, and either through screens or defensive lack of focus, he'll end up with a corner three wide open because the defender got lost in the mess, or the defender just stopped trailing him, and which is the stupidest thing that you could do. I think that in the playoff series you could take that stuff away. And if Livingston is in the game, I would actually take a strategy that the Warriors used against Memphis, which is basically don't guard him on the perimeter. Maybe put a center on Livingston, and because he's not a three-point threat at all. Put somebody who's not a big man who's not very comfortable on the perimeter on Livingston, and basically say, hey, if you're going to bring in such a poor shooter or unwilling shooter, we're going to take our chances, kind of perhaps getting closer to Steph or Thompson and stopping them that way. So what do you think of that last point? Do you speed it up? Do you knock it down? Or am I just a rambling idiot? Let me know. Like and subscribe. And bye-bye.